All right, English teacher friends, so welcome to another writing workshop. This time we're going to showcase my templates in terms of how they can be incorporated to construct an argument essay. So something closely akin to FRQ3 on the AP Lang exam. So I'll give you kind of the impetus for this particular assignment. In the district that I teach in upstate New York, engagement was abysmal last year. I was really fighting tooth and nail with students to get them to buy in, to engage, to get them to produce. And ultimately, it became an issue of compliance. And I had this big epiphany of, well, myself as an educator, am I grading for compliance or am I grading for learning? And what it came down to was this for me. We have in some of our classes some very prescriptive curriculum, and I needed to say I'm not doing it, or I'm going to greatly modify it and adapt it because kids are just checked out and they're not doing anything. So at the time of recording this, I am entering my second week of the academic year. So we got the first week under our belt last week, and we're going to begin our writing instruction and our writing workshops tomorrow and all of next week. So we start after Labor Day in upstate New York. So at the time of recording this, it's September 11th, 2022. So, with my 11th grade Regent students and my AP Lang students, we're going to talk about the relevancy gap. I've been reading a ton about this. Why are kids disengaged? Why are students not being compliant? Why are they blowing off assignments? And what did COVID do to traditional education, like that traditional paradigm? So, in this particular essay, we're going to explore that. We're going to have a Socratic seminar. I'll probably do my discussion modality of the Plato's Plato discussion with my students, and we'll hash this out and do a good argumentative writing workshop assignment around this. So let me show you the prompt. And then I'll walk you through how to construct the introductory paragraphs using my template of the declarative and inverted thesis. And then, as always, for body paragraphs, we'll go syllogistically. So, brand new essay, same old template. So, it can be used across the expository modes. So, whether or not we're doing argument, synthesis, persuasion, literary analysis, rhetorical analysis, it's always declare, invert the thesis, body paragraph syllogistically. So that's how we roll. For this prompt, it says, in a recent educational post, Laura Acione made the following assertion. Students cite the primary driver for their struggles in education as the perceived lack of relevance between life and their studies. So typically what we do is have some kind of discussion where we unpack that with regards to the next part of the assignment. Taking this claim into consideration, challenge, qualify, refute, or agree with Acione. Be certain to provide plenty of textual support to defend your position. So we fill our whiteboards and our easels with textual support. And I basically, divide my board and my easel into challenge, qualify, refute, or agree. And we write down some examples for textual support. And it's just sort of a pre-writing exercise. The discussion is the pre-writing exercise. All right. So one of the things I always talk about when I work with teachers is the following idea. You got to Bob Ross your instruction. So provide plenty of models and exemplars. Everything that you see in the screen, in the slides to come, I wrote. I think it's vital that teachers position themselves as the expert writer in the classroom and paint with your students. Just like Bob Ross painted with his students, we, in a proverbial sense, paint introductions and bodies with our students. So all the models and exemplars I wrote for my students. And it's as simple as saying, all right, guys, I showed you 3 declarative and 3 inverted theses. On your mark, get set, go, write yours. Decide, are you going to declare or invert? And it totally demystifies the process for them. So it's a very good practice. Position yourself as the expert in the classroom, the veritable Bob Ross of composition. So the question is this: how do I write the introductory paragraph? And as always, you can declare or invert the thesis. So let's unpack what I mean by that. So, in a sense, we are being posed an essential question, right? Do you agree, disagree, or are you going to ride the fence with regards to Asione's quote? So, you can begin with the thesis, just boom, drop your position. So, of the rhetorical positions that you can take to defend, qualify, challenge, refute, where are you going? And you can state that right out of the gate in the first sentence. For struggling and emerging writers, it's actually a very safe place to go. The kids that stare at their paper, their blank sheet of paper, and say, "I don't know what I'm doing," even after you've modeled it extensively for them, that's the best place to start. From there, you flesh it out with context and background. It's an academic paper, so I want to see tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is just a little bit of your average run of the mill SAT level caliber word. Sentence constructs. In my YouTube channel, I have a lot of videos that highlight how I run my Nuance Academy. So for tier 2 level vocabulary, I run a word study academy all year long, intensive vocabulary study in my classes for my AP Lit students, Lang students, my 11 Regents kids, my Gen Ed students, my dual enrollment students. It doesn't matter, vocab up the wazoo. For sentence constructs, in terms of establishing better voice rhythm and flow, for my AP teachers out there, getting the sophistication point. Strunk White, in a book called Write It Right, in something known as rule number 18, they make the assertion that there's 12 different ways to construct a single sentence. So you'll see my students manipulate their syntax in ways that there's great variety at the syntactical level. They know the names of all the sentence constructs, and they really are masterful at punctuation. Most of them, the ones that give me an iota of effort. I really hammer basics with my students, so I do that in my Nuance Academy. And then every introduction is going to be 4 sentences, no more, no less, exactly 4 sentences. You can go in the reverse and invert the thesis. And by this, you end with the thesis. So you might begin with a hook and analogy, or just basic context and background. Sprinkle in the tier 2. Sentence constructs, 4 sentences. So one of the things that I want to do early in the year with my students is model that it's neat. Good writing is not a matter of just pouring a bunch of $1 million words into your essays. Some students have this idea that the bigger the words they use, the better the writing they're doing. And to get the sophistication point, right, to really wow your reader, it's a teeter-totter balance of the colloquial, the vernacular, and the academic. So I want to begin that conversation with my models and exemplars and show students how to do that. And in my YouTube channel, I have a bunch of exercises around voice lessons. How do you teach that teeter-totter balance? So go digging in my YouTube channel if you would like to see some activities to foster that. So here's my first one. We'll decide after I read it whether it's declarative inverted. We'll look at the vocab, we'll look at the sentence structures, and then just take a look at kind of the chronological progression of ideas. So again, it's going to be exactly 4 sentences, declare or invert. In every possible way, school should be a microcosm of the real world. With that said, however, it is clear that much of the curriculum and policies currently in place are disconnected from the purposes of preparing students for the next phase of their lives. Given the lack of relevancy, students are not only disengaged, many are no longer complying and playing the game of school. Asione's assertions are spot on. Without relevancy, not much is happening in terms of getting a meaningful education. So let's start first with thesis, because in the introductory paragraph, that's the gusto. You need that. Where is the thesis? And I spy with my little eye, it comes in the last sentence. So this is a quintessential, straight up inverted thesis. So you can see, the student, I wrote it, I'm pretending to be a student. You don't need to start with a hook or an analogy. Just kind of dive in. Show your cards like a poker match. Show your poker face. And ultimately what we're going to do here is begin to lay the lines, the threads for our line of reasoning. So in terms of establishing promises to our readers, these are the things that I'm going to discuss in my body paragraph. That's what I mean by show your cards. So you can see that I'm agreeing with the assertion. Take a look at the vocabulary. Good stuff. Microcosm, disconnected is nice. Relevancy is in the prompt. Disengaged, complying, assertions. So don't overdo it. You stay in your wheelhouse. But look at the sentence constructs. The second sentence in particular, I really like. This stop and go that some students have a natural knack for. With that said, however, it is clear that much of the curriculum and policies currently in place are disconnected from the purposes of preparing students for the next phase of their lives. Given the lack of relevancy, right? Students are not only disengaged, parenthetical, right? So my students are, it's early in the academic year for me. I've only had them 1 week, but over time, we're going to learn all of this stuff. Good use of the dash in the last sentence. So that's what I mean by sentence constructs to achieve voice, rhythm, and flow. So you don't want to overdo the tier 2. You got to stay in your wheelhouse and mix it in with a little bit of colloquial and vernacular. And I think any AP reader, if this is like a student writing for an AP Lang exam, would say, yeah, this kid out of the gate is definitely headed towards that sophistication point. This is pretty darn good. So, and that's the other thing. When I model for my students, I never dumb it down. Bob Ross never dumbed it down. Show them your best. So here's another one. Assione hit the nail on the head. So this is declarative, right? And I'm kind of being hyperbolic a little bit with the colloquial and vernacular because it's early in the year. I just want to show students that it's fair game for them to be 16, 17, hip, spunky, flair, right? So they can do this. Assione hit the nail on the head. So that declares, we know we're agreeing. At the high school level, institutions really need to consider whether or not they're encouraging and grading compliance or true meaningful learning. Unfortunately, much of what is being assigned is wildly divorced from the realities of life. The system is broken and in radical need of change. Exactly 4 sentences, context, background. Tier 2, thesis first or thesis last, and teeter-totter balance that academic with the colloquial and the vernacular. So great words in here. Compliance is nice. I like the use of the word divorced in that context, and even words like radical. So as you can see, students don't need to completely overdo the vocabulary, but it does need to be academic. So we do a lot of talk about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Tier 3 tends to be that domain specific vocabulary. So like when I see my car mechanic, for example, he tends to talk in very complicated terminologies like, Christian, your rear dual drive shaft valve. And I'm like, rear dual drive shaft valve, what the hell is that? I don't know what you're talking about, right? So computer guys, get into domain specific stuff, doctors, lawyers. So, ultimately for like rhetorical analysis and things of that nature, we'll get into tier 3, but for straight up argument, there's really no need to until you get into your textual support. So here's another one. Folks like Assione are the reason why the system isn't working. There are too many chefs in the proverbial kitchen as far as teaching goes. Everyone from parents and politicians are hijacking the classroom so that teachers can no longer teach. Assione, as well as a long list of other characters, need to stay in their lane and let teachers do their jobs, and the relevancy issue will then be fully addressed and resolved. So again, it doesn't matter, thesis first or thesis last, and then let's talk about line of reasoning, because that's ultimately what the introductory paragraph is going to do. In the ensuing body paragraphs, this student has made some promises to us. I'm anticipating some paragraphs about parents and politicians hijacking the classroom. And my body paragraph, I did write a body paragraph for this, a syllogistic body paragraph. I'll show you how this one fleshes out and sustains the line of reasoning. But it's really cool, again, in terms of that colloquial vernacular academic. Too many chefs in the kitchen, mixed with good vocab like proverbial, it's all good. Stay in their lane. Our students say, "Stay in your lane, bro." They use colloquial expressions like that. As long as it's balanced with the academic, it's fair game. And I'm content, especially for my AP Lang friends, even the lit friends, even though you guys don't do argument on your exam. This is how you get the sophistication point. The punctuation has to be perfect, and then that teeter-totter balance in the voice is really crucial. So I got one more for you, and this one qualifies. So look at how the first sentence qualifies the thesis. To some extent, Acione is spot on and a bit wayward all at the same time. So you've shown your cards, shown your poker face. We know that we're going to qualify. So let's kind of see the direction of the qualification. And then the body paragraphs will get into our reasons why we're qualifying. A major educational issue today is that the system isn't being responsible in terms of holding kids to account. Instead, so much instructional time is being spent pandering to the ridiculous needs of students, which is made worse by parents' ludicrous demands. But on the flip side, curriculum does in fact need to be relevant and grounded in real-world applications. Otherwise, there's no point apart from the mere assigning of busy work, right? So all of these, and you'll see these theses like come into play again as I get into the body paragraphs. You're basically front loading your argument. So in the introductory paragraph, you don't get into your reasons why. All right, that's going to be reserved for the first premise of the body paragraphs. So just a little bit of context and background. The best way for me to say it is show your poker face, show your cards, right? So tell them where your argument is going. We're kind of like a roadmap. It's you're front loading. I lied. I got one more for you. Let's face it. High schools exist because society needs to warehouse the young. For decades, it's never been about learning or educating. It's about keeping kids off the street. But it seems that COVID woke students up to the fact that school has virtually zero relevance to their lives, and they're beginning to act out and speak up. As long as there's a disconnect between school and the real world, that perceived lack of relevancy will always be there. So this is another classic inverted. Thesis comes last. You see that? Tier 2 sentence constructs. I like that opening. Let's face it. Dash. Right? Good syntactical maneuver there to make a nice emphatic expression out of the gate. And I think those are key syntactical maneuvers for the sophistication point. So the next question is this: how do I write the body paragraphs? And for those of you that are familiar with my work, you're going to say, holy cow, this guy's not lying. The syllogistic method can be used every single time. So for synthesis, argument, persuasion, everything just stays the same. The only difference for this particular writing workshop is we're not doing rhetorical analysis, so we're not going to be using rhetorical terms and or devices, and we're not doing literary analysis, so we're not going to use literary terms and devices. We're just straight up arguing. So this is why I begin my academic year with argument. I think it's easier. It's the easiest because the textual support is going to come from the kid's head. So here's the syllogistic method in a nutshell. And if you want to do a deep dive into this and get like a good historical overview, check out my YouTube channel. I have a couple of videos where I kind of give the history of the syllogistic method. So I'm going to give you kind of a cursory glance right now at it. So it's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle invented it. And he ran a school called the Lyceum, where the rich aristocratic boys would go to learn about polemics, oration, debate, word wrangling, wordsmithing, kind of like what our lawyers do to some extent today. And they would throw out these big, pithy, juicy, essential questions like, what is justice? Which is the core essential question to one of the seminal Platonic texts, Plato's Republic. So the philosophical think tankers step to the mic and they drop their definition of what justice is. They drop the mic, and then the other students and philosophers gather around and they find all the bullet holes in that definition. And basically, a definition is a syllogism. It's when you go from premise to conclusion. So if I were to say, premise one, arsenic is deadly. Premise two, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. You would say, wow, that's cogent. And that's Aristotle's word, cogent arguments. We in composition today talk about line of reasoning. And I talk about, I use the word cogency with my students, and I talk about being just locked in logically to be like of bulletproof reasoning. And oftentimes when our students write, they only present the second premise. I've read thousands of FRQ3s on the AP language exam, and most kids, for real, I'll do a workshop on this at some point in time, only present the second premise. They present their textual support, and that's it. And they've lost track of the demand of the assignment, is that you got to argue. You got to argue. So we're going to make sure that we argue from start to finish. On FRQ1 on the Lang exam, the directions state your argument must be central 3 times. And I say it with argument, which is just kind of a no-brainer. Like, yeah, you got to argue. So premise one, instead of using terms and devices, we're going to argue a why reason. So you noticed in all 5 introductions, the student, it was me, I wrote those, does not give a why reason. You don't say why. You don't get into your textual support in the introductory paragraph. You don't even get into your textual analysis. So the why is going to come in the first premise. To keep that argument central, I like it that students take 3 sentences to articulate the why reason. And I'll model that for you a few times. It's kind of tricky to do. You got to really Bob Ross the heck out of that. It's confusing to kids what a why reason is. And I have a couple of training wheels in my examples that will help you and your students out. Textual support, it's coming from recall. In this particular essay, I invited kids to write from the first person narrative point of view. I want them to reflect because ultimately, early in the academic year, I want to see who's playing and who's not playing as far as my students go. Who's going to play the game of school and who's not going to play the game of school? And to what extent do I need to modify my curriculum so that kids are engaged? Because if I have another, I just know from my line of business that the engagement was probably the biggest issue last year in the 2021-2022 academic year across the board nationally. Kids were just checked out. So I want to have a conversation. I want to have real talk with them and say, what can I do on my end as your teacher to make sure that you're learning, growing, and maturing? What can I do with regards to my content and my instruction to ensure that we're meeting the principal needs, the principal demands of why you're here every day in school? So that textual support is going to come from their heads. The conclusion is the textual analysis, and this is where we link back to the prompt and the thesis. And I always tell my students that the first premise is a promise. You got to go shake hands with that brother in the end. So really smart students ask good questions, and they say, all right, Mr. Kuhn, we're using templates. If an introductory paragraph is to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less, what are you looking for in a syllogistic body paragraph? And I tell them, I'm looking for 10 to 12 sentences. Don't exceed it. You'll find once kids get into the second premise, they want to go on and on and on and on. Some of them. They go bananas when they can talk about themselves or something that they know deeply well. So let's take a look here. It's going to comprise 2 slides. I couldn't put it all on one slide. So you see the little continued down there at the end. It just means it's going to go on to the next slide. So as I already alluded to, The first three sentences are going to set up the why reason. So let's see how this goes. You got to stay anchored in the prompt, anchored in the thesis, state your why reason. The relevancy gap exists for a number of reasons. So I did that intentionally. For my students who don't quite understand what a why reason is, I'm going to have them steal that sentence from me, just kind of as a sentence feeder there. All right. So a mentor sentence. The relevancy gap exists for a number of reasons. We're anchored to the thesis and we're anchored to the prompt. And then I'm going to have them just enumerate. First, the bulk of what comprises the high school curriculum, especially mathematics, has zero pragmatic value, so is therefore useless. Second, if schools continue to grade compliance instead of learning, this gap will only increase. So during my writing workshops with students, I often have them put the language of their first premise into the language of a promise. So if I put this into the language of a promise, I promise you, dear reader, that I'm going to talk about how mathematics, as presently comprised in a high school curriculum, has no pragmatic value. Second, I'm going to talk to you about how we are grading compliance and not learning. I have to talk about those two things. Since I talked about mathematics first, in my fourth sentence, I need to start talking about mathematics because the fourth sentence introduces the second premise. I have to talk about math. And then after I'm done with math, I have to talk about the difference between compliance and learning. And that's it. I can't talk about anything else. I have to keep that premise or that promise. So one of the things that I'm teaching early in the year is kind of some training wheel transitions to keep everything connected. So to transition into the second premise, you immediately get into your textual support. So check this out. Take, for example, and again, I'm going to have that be a mentor transition for my kids if they need it. Trigonometry and algebra. While learning about things like the quadratic formula and Pythagorean theory might challenge the brain, when will these learnings actually be used in life? Apart from preparing kids to be good Jeopardy players, knowing this kind of stuff is beyond useless. So some of the things that I was talking about in the introduction, I want to see in the body paragraph as well. Have personality, have spunk, have flair. So I'm going to show kids that you can be your spunky 16, 17-year-old self and make comments like that. Preparing kids to be good Jeopardy players and this kind of stuff is beyond useless. I think that's really key to the sophistication point, is to have personality, to have some pizzazz as a writer. All right, so let's keep going with mathematics here. Imagine a mathematics class where the theory, technique, and applicability were grounded in real world situations. What one would see is students taking measurements to install hardwood floors or crunching numbers to balance a checkbook. This kind of learning is relevant and pragmatic. Filing taxes is a real world thing. So why aren't kids learning how to do this in their general education studies? The reason is this: schools are grading compliance and not learning. Do you see the transition there? So I also want to talk to my kids early in the academic year about asking rhetorical questions in their writing. I noticed that struggling and emerging writers completely overuse rhetorical questions. I'm not opposed to them, especially in argument, persuasion, and synthesis. I think they could be highly effective. So I want to show my students how to use rhetorical questions. When I use them in my writing, I actually answer them. So go back to this. So, comma, why aren't kids learning how to do this in their general education studies? Question mark. The reason is this, dash. Schools are grading compliance and not learning. So now if we go back up to the promise of the first premise, I'm at my where I say second. If schools continue to grade compliance instead of learning, this gap will only increase. So I'm keeping my promise, right? You got to go chronologically, sequentially in terms of how you drop it in the first premise. What does an A plus mean on a what does an A plus on a transcript really mean? It means that this particular student complied at 100%. What does an F mean? It's a kid that didn't see the relevancy in the assigned task and refused to play the game of school. So I tell my kids, in terms of writing this essay, you got to say relevancy a few times in your paper. And it's got to be in the first premise or in the conclusion, or you can sprinkle it in the second premise, like in the tail end of the second premise. But to make sure you're really hammering home the prompt, it's vital that you're talking about relevancy. In the end, link it back to the thesis and the prompt. Ascione couldn't have said it any better. Not until schools close the relevancy gap and assess true learning, the educational system will remain a joke. So again, keeping that colloquial vernacular academic from start to finish. Just hammer that sophistication point, manipulate that syntax for voice, rhythm, and flow. Don't overdo the vocab and stay cogent, my friends. Stay cogent. So, question for you. What do I do next? Because my guys are going to write a 4-paragraph essay for this. For all FRQs, Lang and Lit, my students do 4 paragraphs. And doing this exercise in my Regents level class, I'm only going to do 4 paragraphs. What do you do next? Bust out another syllogism. Check it out. This is going to change my angle on this. But take a look here. 3 sentences for the first premise. I'm making a promise to my reader, and I'm going to establish my line of reasoning. If one is looking for a culprit as to why the relevancy gap exists, do you see that? You always got to be talking about relevancy. Have to stay anchored in the prompt. If one is looking for a culprit as to why the relevancy gap exists, they can point the finger at politicians and parents. If the educational system continues to allow outsiders to meddle in curriculum and policy design, the system will continue to splinter. Unfortunately, because politicians and parents have hijacked the system, kids have become increasingly checked out. All right, so I have to go in order here in terms of my promise. I first mentioned politicians as being a culprit, then parents. So I have to go in that order. Politicians, then parents. If I talk about anything else extraneous, I'm going to break my line of reasoning. And if I neglect to talk about politicians and parents, I have a break in my line of reasoning. So this really helps kids keep very cogent in their arguments, very mathematical, very computative. So second premise begins, fourth sentence. Get right into the politicians. Going back to the presidency of George W. Bush and his implementation of No Child Left Behind, American high schools have become obsessed with standardized tests. In a sense, the system is not creating an educated citizenry, but a bunch of widgets that conform to a standardized way of thinking. And again, look at the colloquial, the vernacular, the academic. Just follow this line of reasoning here. The irony is that kids are graded by the same standards that the government grades meat products. Further, these policies also belie the fact that government does not trust its teachers, so therefore feels compelled to make instructional curriculum for them. That's another irony. Teachers are beyond qualified to teach. They are compelled to hold a master's degree in their field of expertise. What degrees do these politicians hold? So again, I'm teaching the rhetorical question here. So look at how I do this. What degrees do these politicians hold? The relevancy gap would be closed if government simply trusted teachers to do what they're supposed to do, teach. Right? Now, I'm not done because I promised a discussion about parents, and I got to get there. And the same can be said for parents. So you see, we're going to have a big discussion about transitions as well in this writing workshop. Parents, more so than ever, are calling the shots as far as what content does and does not get taught. As an example, several districts in the country are no longer allowed to read classic texts like Huck Finn, Mockingbird, and Handmaid's Tale because a few parents objected to their content. So I talk to my guys like, get specific, get as specific as possible. Parents should not have more power than teachers to be saying what should and should not be taught. Administrators and school boards need to put parents in their place. I'm at the conclusion now. In my first example, let me go back. Do you see how I dropped Asione's name? That's super training wheel, right? Very scaffolded. So struggling and emerging writers, probably a good idea to have them do that to make sure that everything's linked back to the thesis. Your better writers could go this route. Kids struggle to see the relevance between their life and studies because of all this meddling. Let teachers teach. Governments and parents need to get out of the decision-making process and stay in their proverbial lane. As long as you're talking about relevancy, you're still in the prompt and you're still in the thesis. You don't need to say Asione's name. And it's probably more skillful not to. It's a little elementary when students do that, but I'm going to show them both ways of doing things. So hopefully you found this to be useful, and I know it's going to be a great conversation piece for my students as we talk about why are we showing up to school every day? What's my job as a teacher? And what's their job as a student? I think it's a wonderful, wonderful conversation piece that gets them really thinking about their exigence in the classroom. So if you like what you see and want to learn more from me as your lead teacher, know that I'm offering a Teach It Right 5-week mastermind that's being hosted and run through the National Writing Project. So what we're going to do is meet for 5 consecutive Sundays. The next one begins September 25th, 2022. So we'll meet from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for 5 consecutive weeks. Here's the kicker though. NWP knows that most teachers need to have professional development hours. They are affording a badge of a 10-hour completion for a 5-hour course. There's very little homework. You just got a little bit of prep, 10-15 minutes in between sessions, and you get 10 hours of completion. So we go over all my templates across the expository modes. We'll do a deep dive into my alternative grading methods so that you can free yourselves up of your weekends and evenings. And then we do my Plato's Plato discussion modality, which I didn't get into in this video, but in terms of getting my students into that good textual support, the discussion must first front load that. And then it's already fall time, and in November, Tim Freitas, Brandon Abden, and myself will be presenting in California, Anaheim, California, at the NCTE conference. So stay tuned for that. If you would like these slides or any information about my teachings, my offerings, or other content on YouTube, feel free to email me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. If you want more information on NCTE and National Writing Project courses, you can visit my webpage at www.teachinghowtowrite.com. So hope you are well. Happy teaching, happy writing.